In this lesson, we're going to look at a layering structure that will really simplify your modeling once you import this plan into 3D Max. Now, one of the key rules to remember is that when you click on a layer of 2D imported geometry in 3D Max, it's going to select every object on that layer as if it was one object. You will see this later once we pull all of this information into 3D in the next lesson. Now, what I generally like to do with a simple project such as this, which is just a two-story building, is that I'd like to have, let's say, 4 layers that are used for the entire file. So one layer can be the whole ground floor, another one can be the upper level, one layer can be for the side elevation, and the last layer can be for the section over here. So having that type of a structure will mean that you only have 4 layers to work with or click and turn on and off when you're working in your 3D workspace. So you can maximize the layering manager in 3D for all of your 3D layers. So here again, I'm bringing you to the point where you don't want to go and mix a 2D object and a 3D object on the same layer when you're working in 3D. You want to be able to completely turn off your 2D geometry as you're working and developing your model in 3D. So all of this has to do with setting up your layer manager in AutoCAD before you actually go and export your plan and use it for modeling in 3D Max. So generally, once I have whichever layering system in AutoCAD, I will go and now make a brand new layering system that I'm going to create as we speak right now. So generally, keeping with the same logic of having a double-digit number as a prefix, I like to have all of the CAD geometry on a 00 layer. So here I will have, for example, ground, and that will bring into all of the objects that are on the ground floor will be under that layer. If you would like to create subcategories of that layer, then you can, for example, have ground contours. You can then create a copy and call this one ground plan, and you can also have another one and call it ground grid, or we can just write grid and text. So what that means is that now we will have these layers over here, and they can now all be on a single color. I generally like to use a dark blue, almost like a blueprint, and then I will go and relayer all of these objects to be to basically fall into that layer. So what you want to do now is you want to select, using the layer isolate, you want to select all of your contours, and once you're happy that those are all of the contours that you want to work with, you can then select them all, and then just in the drop down you can select the correct layer that you want them to be on. So this one will be ground contours. So you'll see that all those objects have now disappeared. What you can also do is you can turn off those layers that are going to be your new layers. So for example, we can just hit the little light bulb next to that layer, and once you've relayed it correctly, it will actually disappear out of your viewport. So you're working through a process of elimination. You basically want to eliminate all of the objects that you're looking at so that they are all on the correct layers. So next we want to do text and grids. So we can now use the layer isolate, we can select the grid and we can select the text objects, and we can isolate that away. So here as well, same thing, we just take all of those objects and we apply it to the grid and text layer, and you'll see that they start disappearing now. So the section line we don't necessarily need. You can remember where that is. I'm going to delete it. You can also keep it if you feel unsure, if you have too many sections in place. Perhaps let's just keep it, but we'll delete the end lines here, and we'll apply it to the grid and text layer as well. So next you have everything else. So here you can create another split for yourself where you put all of your landscaping on a single ground layer and all of your furniture on another ground layer. It really depends on up to you as to how many subcategories of that ground you want to have. Obviously you don't want to fill up your entire layer manager in 3D, so just keep that in mind as you are doing this relayering process. So just to keep things slightly more split, to keep a greater level of clarity, I'm going to add 2 more layers, and that's going to be ground landscape and ground furniture. Again, I mentioned if you don't have too much detail, just put the entire ground floor, no matter what, on it onto a single layer, and you'll see that things will really speed up for you. So here, let's go and turn those off. That's done. Now, same thing, we want to select everything that's going to be on this landscaping layer. So all of these roads, things, pavement edges, you just want to get all of that in. All of this as well. Right click and just convert that to ground landscaping. Next, you want to make sure that these are also ground landscaping. In some cases, you will see that things don't relayer, and that is because when you have blocks, you need to go into the blocks and relayer it. What you can also do is just explode your blocks and then relayer it. So you can do that by typing X enter. Select all of those blocks that you want to explode. You can also isolate them beforehand. Right click, now they're all exploded. You can re-isolate them and reapply them to the correct layer. And I'm going to do this one last time for all the furniture objects. You can see I've extracted them out, and I'm going to explode them and then convert them to ground furniture. There we go. And you can just have a look if there are a couple that hadn't been exploded. You can just go and do that manually. Perhaps some of the objects, I know since I was working quite quickly in the last course, some objects won't necessarily be on the perfect layer. I think between landscaping and furniture there might be a few that got trapped on the wrong layer. So you can just manually go and do all of that now. So I'm going to do all of that off camera. I think that you understand the process just by seeing what I've done, and then everything else will just be applied to the final ground plan layer, which is this one over here. So all of your doors, windows, slab edges and all of that will be on that ground plan. So when you're working in 3D, you only need to turn on that one single layer and you can start modeling your entire building just from that single layer alone. You don't need to hinder yourself with having all of your trees and furniture when you're just building your bare walls. So that's the advantage of creating those subcategories. So with the side elevation, you can either just have one single layer again, as I repeat, or you can separate your grid lines, which are the horizontal and vertical lines, and your text onto one layer and then have everything else on another. And that's exactly what I'm going to do now after finishing this lesson for you before we start the actual 3D work. So I'm going to basically take all of that, relayer it, and then right at the end I'm going to use the purge command, which is basically P-U-R-G-E, enter, and you can then click on purge all and purge all items, just as we had done in a much earlier lesson in this course, and that will then delete all of the other layers that are empty because you have now gone and relayered it to your new 00 ground or 00 first and 00 section layering system that you will be using in 3D Max. So what I'm actually going to do now is I'm going to pause this video and I'm going to, just for the last couple of seconds, just show you the results before we actually enter the 3D Max side of things in the next lesson. So here we see that we now have everything relayered to the correct layer that we've now added, and I'll just show you the layer manager, or at least the drop down, and you'll see that everything has now been extracted. You'll see that the only two layers that are remaining are 0 and def points, which are two that you won't get rid of. So just leave those there, and if nothing is on 0 or def points, and you can just unselect those during the import into 3D Max. That I'll show you in the next lesson. So the last thing that you can do just to neaten things up is you can select all of your objects and you can just select by layer on each of these drop downs. So basically everything will now just be a single color and you won't be able to differentiate the difference between all those different line types. So you won't have any that are dashed. It'll all just look very standard, almost like a normal blueprint in black and white. So what you can do is you can also unselect all of your layers and you can just check that everything is correctly layered. So it's a good idea just to turn everything off and then one by one just turn on your elevations and just see that there aren't any foreign objects that are missing from these elevations. So you can do that one by one and just get get a final check to make sure that nothing is missing once you are in the 3D stage. So the last thing that I just wanted to mention before I finish this lesson and move on is you want to make sure in the AutoCAD stage that you know where your 0 point, or at least your datum point, is for your model. So what you're going to do when we import it is the elevations and sections are going to be turned by 90 degrees so that they are upright in 3D space. You want them to be projections of the sides from whichever point they are being drawn from. So you need to know which rotation point you're going to be using, and you want to make sure that that is clearly defined. So in our case, we have a look here at the elevation that is drawn from the side, and we can see that 0.00 is this line here. So that is essentially going to be the line that you are going to rotate about. So just make sure that you have those lines well drawn on your plans, or at least your elevations and sections most importantly, so that you can clearly click on that line and rotate your elevations so that you don't have any elevations that are at a different height to each other. You want to make sure that everything in the Z dimension in 3D space is correctly positioned in its height. Also a good time just to double check that all of your horizontal and vertical plans are aligned to each other. You want to make sure that your upper floor is perfectly aligned horizontally so that one isn't higher than the other, and you want to make sure that this also lines up with the side. So just make sure by looking at your grid lines you can draw a temporary construction line and just see that everything is neatly in place. That's the best thing to do, and once all of that is done, then you can be confident that your plan is at its most reduced and perfect state, and we will now import this into 3D Max in the next lesson.